Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. I hope that you are all keeping safe and well and that you enjoyed my last video. Now we're going to take a brief interruption today to continue another series that I kind of half started a while ago, where I take you on a tour of my bookshelf. Besides being an archaeologist, I'm also a huge bookworm. Particularly, I love to read a lot of fiction, historical fiction, sci-fi, fantasy. I just thought that maybe some other people would also be interested in reading what I'm reading. My previous video covered my top shelf, which is mostly my large hardcover book. Today we are doing the middle shelf, which is more like trade paperback and like medium-sized hardcover book. So we'll start from one end and we'll just work our way to the other. As with my top shelf, I try to keep books by the same author together, but I don't alphabetize them otherwise at all. I have no real cataloging system, so just so you're aware. So the first two books we're going to cover here are The Bear and the Nightingale and The Girl in the Tower by Katherine Arden. These are two books in a series, and there is a third book. It's called the Winter Night Trilogy. And what kind of made me pick up these books was a slightly different setting than what I'm used to. Rather than being set in a very like Western European kind of background, this is set in Russia. It's a world I haven't explored much. I really enjoyed the beginning of this book, but the more I read these, I kind of lost interest. Certainly with The Bear and the Nightingale, I felt I was kind of waiting for the book to start and until I got to like near the end, and then I realized that it wasn't going to kind of build to what I was expecting it to. So I think where I expected it to go in my head didn't match up in real life. I also felt like the protagonist doesn't ever learn from her mistakes. Like she just continues being who she is, and not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but she doesn't really show a lot of growth in a character, so it's a bit more two-dimensional than I would like. But I think it's quite a good young adult series. Next we have The Tethered Mage by Melissa Caruso. I picked this up because I was just looking for something to read in a bookstore. I didn't mind it, but it didn't completely captivate me to continue reading. It's something that I'll maybe pick up the sequels like on Kindle or from a secondhand bookstore. I was looking for a bit more complexity, which is my own fault, because sometimes it's kind of hard to tell the difference between something that's definitely kind of like young adult teen fantasy and stuff that's but somehow still makes it onto like the entirely fantasy shelf at the bookstore. Next we actually have 4 books all by the same author. All of these are written by Becky Chambers, who 100% is my favorite like up and coming, or I guess already here, science fiction author. I really love her books. These 3 are actually part of a kind of very loosely tied together series. The books each follow individual sets of characters, but they're all in the same universe, and there are connections between characters from previous books. And then this one here is its own independent novella. The first one that you should read is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. I picked this up in a bookstore based on the recommendation of a bookseller who said to me that it was like Firefly, the TV show with aliens, which immediately sold me on these books because I love Firefly. I've reread all of her books more than once, and I just really love the way that she's thought out her universe. The way that she has developed her universe to me seems like really plausible. Like I could really see that being the future of humanity and how things are going to work out. And you can tell that she's really based a lot of the way that she's developed things in science and the way that we currently understand space and astrophysics and all that kind of stuff. Having that kind of like background that is just so plausible, I really enjoyed. And the way that she writes her characters, you know, is very inclusive. There's LGBTQ characters, there are multiracial characters. I really enjoy that. The order that you should read these books in is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, A Close and Common Orbit, Record of a Spaceborne Few. She is currently writing another book in the Wayfarer series. Her novella here, To Be Taught If Fortunate, it's a book that I can't say I loved it because the ending made me sad. Very much draws on a lot of things that are very popular today, like crowdfunding. The entire idea about this book is crowdfunded space exploration for the purpose of like science, not to colonize, not to militarize, and not to conquer. It's just to explore. But like I said, the ending of it is a bit of a downer without giving anything away. But at the same time, I can't really verbalize my emotions that I had around it, but it was just a very thought-provoking read for me. If you're going to take anything away from this particular shelf, please read these books because they are amazing. Okay, so this is Dinotopia Thunderfalls. The reason that this is on my shelf is because I brought it over from home to give to a coworker who had a young child for them to try and read. It's kind of ironic that I love these books in a way, because archaeologists constantly fight against the trope that we dig up dinosaurs. We don't. That's paleontologists. It's completely different. But at the same time, I do personally have, like many people, a love of dinosaurs, and Dinotopia is definitely one of those book series, worlds, whatever, that inspired that. The original book of Dinotopia is written by a guy called James Gurney, and it's about like a Victorian era scientist engineer and his son who wash up on an island where it turns out that the dinosaurs on this island escaped the great cataclysm that wiped out the rest of them, and in the ensuing years they have created like a civilized society that has become incorporated with humans as they've washed up on a beach, because it's like, I don't know, kind of similar to the Bermuda Triangle. It has a reef around the island and there's lots of storms, so people regularly wash up on the shores, and together dinosaurs and people have built this Dinotopia together. And James Gurney has written several other books. It's set in the Dinotopia universe, but they're more adult oriented, like they're much bigger books. I came across these books when I was a teenager, a young teenager, and these are definitely much thinner. These are meant to be read by teens, and they are individual stories set in the world of Dinotopia, written by different authors, but under the license of this big world. There's been TV shows and movies made about this, but it's never really seemed to crack straight into the mainstream for whatever reason and popular culture. They're great books. I recommend them. Lundy Rockfall, Dogger, Fair Island, a celebration of islands around Britain. I got this as a secret Santa gift from someone at work. I don't know who. To be honest, I have not read it because it's just not really my style of book, but I've kept it and I do intend on reading it one day. My Single Friend by Jane Costello. This is a book that I picked up in a charity shop because I just needed something to read. It is what I would refer to as chick lit, literature for women that's not quite a romance novel. I don't think I've ever reread it, but the first time around it was interesting. Can't say that I didn't see how the plot was going to go from page one. Next we have The Tale of Murasaki by Liza Dolby. This is another one that I picked up in a charity bookstore, and it caught my eye because Murasaki is actually the author of like the world's oldest fiction novel, The Tale of Genji, and her book was written in Japan in the 11th century. So I thought it would be interesting to obviously read a historical fiction novel about the woman who wrote that novel. It's set in an era of Japan that there isn't a lot of historical fiction in the Western world in English to read about that I am aware of. If I'm missing out, please let me know in the comments below. I can't say that I loved this book because the prose of it did not gel with me entirely. The author did a lot of research and she combined a lot of stuff from the period into this novel, which I enjoyed. Like there's a specific kind of poem that is typical of this period that is put throughout the book, which I appreciated that detail, but at the same time I just didn't get it. That being said, I think it's a really interesting novel to read. I think Murasaki is an interesting person to know about, and if you are interested in learning more about her, this would be a good book to do so. Okay, so next we have Bitter Greens by Kate Forsyth. So if you watched my previous video, you will know that I recommended a previous book by Kate Forsyth called The Wild Girl, and this is another book by her, and again, it's great. They are not in the same series or anything, but in a way they're related. So whereas The Wild Girl was about the girl who gave the Grimm brothers quite a few of their stories and ended up marrying one of them, this story alternates between the perspectives of a Rapunzel living through the like real Rapunzel story, not the Disney-fied Rapunzel story, and Charlotte Rose de la Force, who was a noblewoman in the court of Louis XIV, who is arguably one of the first people to write down the story of Rapunzel, and she also had a very interesting life. It's a really engrossing read, especially if you're one of those people that's really into kind of like fairy tale centered fiction. The Sharp Hook of Love by Sherry Jones. I received this book as an advanced reading copy from Sherry Jones like 5 years ago when it came out. I had read her previous novels, Four Sisters All Queens and either The Sword or the Jewel of Medina, and I love Four Sisters All Queens. I thought it was a really interesting novel covering the dynamic of four medieval princesses who all in their own who were sisters, who all became queens of France, England, Germany, and Naples, I think. The Sword of Medina and the Jewel of Medina are a duology about one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad. Aisha is interesting in that the author actually, she got death threats and a lot of backlash against her writing about this person because she is so closely associated with Muhammad, and that is a very sensitive subject for a lot of Muslims, and people didn't appreciate her writing a historic fiction about that person. But that's neither here nor there. I had read those books and she was writing this book. I followed her on social media and she was looking for readers. I volunteered and she gave me this book. Long intro. This book is about a couple named Heloise and Abelard, who are a real historic people that lived in France in 12th century Paris. Abelard, he was like a famous teacher, and Heloise was a woman who was like extremely highly educated, and they had a very passionate love affair that is recorded in posterity by these letters that they later wrote to each other. This is the fictionalized account of their love story. I read it and I didn't hate it, I didn't dislike it, but I also didn't love it. I think that was just some of the ways that she chose to portray some of the scenes between Heloise and Abelard. Of her books, it's probably my least favorite, but I still would recommend her as an author. If you want to read anything by her, definitely Four Sisters, All Queens is what I would recommend maybe over this book. The Gods of Love by Nicolas Mostin, I don't really know how to say this last name, is not a typical book that I would pick up, but I did. It's fiction. It's very much set with the idea of the Greek gods are still alive and well, functioning and manipulating humanity long after we thought they stopped. And the idea is that there is a girl in here that is, fated by destiny to stop the plot of one of the gods for doing something dastardly. I enjoyed this book. I don't remember that much about it. It's a good one-off, so if you're just looking for something short and quick to read, this is a good book. Again, we have two books by the same author here, Uprooted and Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. I actually bought Uprooted at the same time as I bought The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, which was probably one of my most fruitful journeys to the bookstore in a while because I enjoyed both of these books a lot. I've had Naomi Novik recommended to me before for her Temeraire series, but as I think I might have said in my previous video, I tend to gravitate towards characters that I can relate to, so they tend to be female, and the Temeraire series just didn't really appeal to me in that way. Also, I'm not really into steampunk literature, so that didn't really draw me in. But that being said, I do love these ones. They are not related. They seem to be somewhat loosely set in the same world, but there is no relation between either of the two books that I could pick out at least. You could read either one separately, together, or in whatever order you want. That being said, out of these two, my favorite is definitely Uprooted, the first one that I read, partially because it had stuff that I was really familiar with, but then the book also went in a direction that I really didn't expect it to go into. Where I was at the end was definitely not where I thought I was going at the beginning of this book. So I liked that that was really unpredictable. It's the same with Spinning Silver. However, there was just something about it that didn't draw me as much. The main kind of love interest was a lot more mysterious. So I just didn't get, I don't know, the same vibe as I did with Uprooted. My best friend prefers Spinning Silver over Uprooted, so it's very much a matter of personal choice, but I highly recommend both of these books. The Amazons by Adrienne Mayer. This is a nonfiction book, and as you can probably see from my bookmark, I have not gotten very far into it. It is really difficult for me to get through a book at any appreciable pace when I'm reading nonfiction. If it's like a sci-fi or fantasy book, like I could finish probably most of these if I'm just reading one within a day if I was really pushing myself. This kind of book is going to take me a lot longer. The topic of the book is, as it says, Amazons, lives and legends of warrior women in the ancient world, and it talks about where the legends of the Amazons come from. I'm very interested in the content. I picked it up and I read a bit, and then I got distracted and never picked it back up, but I do intend to finish it one day. The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. This was a staff pick at Chapters in Canada. I've made it part way through, but I've never finished it. Maybe I should give it away. It's set in the year 2059. It's a dystopian future London thing, and honestly, I personally am kind of over that genre. I don't find a lot of those books appealing to me anymore. Like, I read the original Hunger Games and quite a few other books that are set in a future with a female protagonist, and then, you know, the typical love triangle and you're against the state and everything. I'm bored with it. It's just not for me anymore, so I've never finished it. So I really should actually just donate this book. Next up, we have another 2 books that I brought over from my library in Canada for a co-worker whose kid was needing something to read. These are 2 books from the Royal Diary series. They were produced by Scholastic, and I know that I got a lot of the originals through book fairs when I was in school. And the premise of every novel is that it covers the life of a famous woman in ancient history, but in the form of a diary at a kind of formative time in her life. For example, this one is about Elizabeth I, and it kind of covers, I think, about the last year or so, maybe 2 years, before her father Henry VIII dies and just as her brother becomes king. The other one that I have here is Kazuno Mia, who was a imperial princess of Japan, who is noted for the fact that she married the shogun, who was like the Japanese prime minister and actually the person in control of the country. And it was the first time that someone from the imperial family was marrying someone from the shogun family. She had a really famous bridal procession across Japan. But one of the things I really loved about them is that at the end of every one of them, there's always like a section at the back that covers the context of this book. So there's always an epilogue that tells you what happens to that princess at the rest of her life after the book ends, because obviously these only cover like a slice of their lives, not the entire thing. And then you will get a historical note, which gives you a bit more context about the world that they were living in, what was going on around them, the period, etc. There's also always a family tree that can help you keep track of who's in their family and other interesting tidbits. So this one, for example, has an illustration of all Henry VIII's wives, paintings of Henry VIII, Edward of England, who is Elizabeth's brother, Mary, her sister, that's Elizabeth herself. Got some pictures of places that she would have lived and needlework that is accredited to her that's in the British Museum, picture of her tomb, and then a little bit about the author. And I just love that part of these novels. And also, may I say, I love the cover art for each and every one of them. They've got like little gold leaf on all the edges of the pages, and it just gives it this kind of very like luxe Royal Diaries feel to them. This is not just a series for white women to learn about their history. These have books set all over the world, which was one of the things that I really loved about them. And they're all about, I'm gonna use the catch-all term princess, even that's not what all these women were called. Obviously, they would have been called, had different titles in their own language, but that's kind of like the loose catch-all term that we would categorize them into being. So I'm just gonna read to you some of the women that are documented in these books. So we have Elizabeth and Kazuno Mia, who, England, Japan, and then there's Cleopatra, the famous, from Egypt, the Marie Antoinette from France, Isabel, the Queen of Castile, Anastasia of Russia, Nzinga, the warrior queen of Matamba in Africa, Keulani, who's Hawaiian, Lady of the Chiao Kuo, who is Chinese, Victoria, again, England, Mary, Queen of Scots from Scotland, Sondok, the Princess in the Moon of Stars, who was a princess and then a queen in the history of Korea, Jahanara, Princess of Princesses, who was the daughter of Shah Jahan, the guy who built the Taj Mahal in India, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, Queen of England, Christina, the Girl King of Sweden, Elizabeth Sissi, who was Empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Witamu, who was a Native American, daughter of a chieftain, the Lady of Palenque, who was a Mayan princess. There's also at least one about a chieftain or princess in Haiti or like the Caribbean. I just love them. I just love these books. These are such formative books for young girls. You will still be able to get copies of them, but they are out of print and they're not making anymore, which is a travesty. I really wish they had been able to continue with this series. I don't know why, maybe they weren't selling enough. They have released like paperback versions of a couple of the more popular ones, but you should be able to find quite a few of them like on used bookstores if you are that interested in buying them. Secret History of the Mongol Queens by Jack Weatherford. This is like the single exception to me struggling to read nonfiction books. I have reread this nonfiction book and I read it with very little difficulty, and I had a very easy time getting through it. This book was one of the sources behind a historical fiction book I read called Tiger Queens by Stephanie Thornton, which is about like the daughters, wives, and daughters-in-law of like Genghis Khan. And this was one of her sources, so I decided to pick it up. And I loved it. It's a setting, it's a background, it's a history I haven't read to death 50 million times before. So that is part of the reason why it kept me hooked, because I was learning something new. It's a really interesting story. The premise of the title is that there is a document called The Secret History of the Mongols. It has been censored since it was written, because it was written sometime in and around the reign of Genghis Khan and then his successive sons. And it has been censored at some point in history to downplay the importance of women in his empire. And so this author has done a ton of research to try and bring some of these stories to light. So he covers a lot of different periods, starts off with like Genghis Khan, and he does a really great job of trying to explain Mongolia, their system, how families worked, how the tribes worked, etc., etc. The stories of the different women, trying to sort through all these different historical references and figure out who's who, because, you know, Genghis Khan actually had the Mongolian alphabet invented, and they weren't exactly a highly literate people. They were very much all about the oral tradition, and a lot of what's written about them is written by people looking at them rather than being written about themselves. So it can be really hard sometimes to sort through and match up all the different historical accounts. A lot of what he talks about is Genghis Khan and the women around him and his empire, and then covers kind of like a period in between where there's the decline of the empire, and then the last little bit is about Manduhai, who is a Mongol queen that with her husband resuscitated a semblance of the Mongol Empire and once again made them a bit of a power to be reckoned with. And allegedly is her and her husband were the people that Queen Isabel of Castile wrote a letter of greeting to and gave to Christopher Columbus when he was going to try and journey to Asia across the ocean, as proving that the world is round. Allegedly, they're the people that the letter was going to be addressed to. So yeah, if you're looking to learn a little bit more about the history of Asia, Genghis Khan, Mongolia in general, highly, highly recommend this book, and anything by Jack Weatherford. I think he's actually received an award from Mongolia for his research work. We're almost there, guys. Empire of Sand by Tasha Suri, about halfway through this one. I picked this up because it's not Western, it's not white, it's different, and I liked the premise of it, and when I started reading it, it was quite interesting, but I kind of lost interest halfway through when the plot started becoming a bit more cookie cutter. So this is more of a young adult than a true fantasy novel. I would say that the plot is fairly easy to predict and see through. It really goes with that trope of like the boy is mean to you or rude to you, and it means he secretly likes you, and I don't know, I'm just really sick of that. So I think that's kind of one of the reasons I kind of lost interest in this book. Writing around it is very interesting, and the setting of it is very interesting. So I will have to finish this at some point, and there is sequels. I know it's part of a series, so I'll have to try those at some point as well, I think. All right, so 2 big books. Again, by the same author. We have City of Brass and Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty. These are part of what's called the Daevabad Trilogy. This is definitely on my list of stuff that I recommend from my shelf. As you may already know, I studied Egyptology and Mesopotamia when I was in my undergrad. I studied and dug in the Kingdom of Jordan for 3 summers, and I have all my life, I would say, have had a fascination and an interest in the history of the Middle East. These books, they just, I think, so effectively blend and introduce you to this culture that you kind of have only had glimpses of, and probably through a biased narrative. So it starts off being set in Cairo in the 18th, 19th centuries, right around when Napoleon and the French are around. And then it very quickly goes in a completely different direction, and it very much is all set in this mythology of the jinn, English word genie, their history in this whole like secret world that exists of jinn, this magical realm of Islamic myth and mythology. The author herself is a convert to Islam and has done a lot of research about these books to try and get everything done correctly. Honestly, I love them. The last book in the trilogy, and this is not an ad, Empire of Gold. I'm so excited to get it and to read it and to finish this trilogy, and also very excited to see what she's going to come up with next, because this is definitely a writer that I will be following what she does and reading her material, I think, for a long time to come. Empress of the Night by Eva Stachniak. This is a book about Catherine the Great. It's historical fiction. It is a sort of, but not really, sequel to another book that she did called The Winter Palace. The Winter Palace was about a lady-in-waiting of Catherine the Great, whereas this is told from the perspective of Catherine the Great as she has multiple strokes and is dying, and it's kind of set as flashbacks to her life. I have finished this, but I wouldn't say that it was as good as The Winter Palace. I definitely enjoyed The Winter Palace more. Maybe it was because it was a story that I didn't already know. I've already read quite a bit about Catherine the Great. I wrote a paper on her once. One of the Royal Diaries books is about her. I already know quite a lot about her life, so this book wasn't really like a revelation for me in terms of the history and what was going on. But if you're looking for something that's well researched, set in Imperial Russia at its height, about Catherine the Great, definitely a book that you should check out. Okay, second last book, T-Rex by W. Howard Stewart. I don't study dinosaurs, but this book is probably solely responsible for the fact that Tyrannosaurus Rex is my favorite dinosaur. I very distinctly remember I got this book as a gift at Easter from my mom. I gobbled it up, and then I gobbled up the rest of them, and then the series ended on a cliffhanger, and I have not been able to find out what's happened to it since. I don't know what's happened to the author. I don't know what happened to the publishing deal. It happened so long ago, there's not a lot of proof online. I wish that he would finish it. This series is amazing. The premise of this is ridiculous and unscientific in that it's a family sailing in the South Pacific. Their boat capsizes. They end up on an iceberg that's broken off from Antarctica, floating towards the equator. And it just so happens that the part of Antarctica that's broken off is full of a bunch of frozen dinosaurs. The children and the main characters of the story are a set of fraternal twins named Nathan and Heather Ann. When they're on the iceberg, Nathan comes across a dinosaur egg in a pool of meltwater that hatches into a T-Rex that imprints on him, and shortly thereafter, they end up on a tropical island. Adventures ensue. They're very short, and they do have illustrations as well throughout the novel to help set the scene of the book. I always kind of describe this as kind of like a Swiss Family Robinson with dinosaurs. Like, this book just goes like full out. The later adventures, like they end up going to El Dorado and all this other stuff. It's like really crazy, but they get to like ride this T-Rex and have this faithful pet killer lizard with them their whole lives, which, to be honest, is something that I would want if I had a choice. It's a great young adult fiction novel. They're just fun. So highly recommend these for kids if you can find them, and if the author is still alive or somebody has his notes and wants to finish the series from the cliffhanger he did, please. If I had money, I would pay you, and I will buy the books. Okay, last but not least, Firebrand by Kristin Britton. This is a big book and a dirty book, apparently. The latest book in a series by Kristin Britton that I have been reading for years. The first book is called Green Rider, and I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this series because it's very interesting. I want to know what happens to the characters. The world is very well developed, but man, the author takes forever, maybe not as long as some authors, J.R.R. Martin, Patrick Rothfuss, as writing her sequels. She takes a long time in between, and she just knows how to torture her reader with some of the scenes that goes on in this book. The love story in particular is very gut and heart-wrenching at times, and she puts her, she has admitted herself, because I follow her on social media, that she likes to torture her characters, and she definitely does. But this is the latest book, probably one of my more favorite ones out of the ones that she's written in the series. Hopefully there will be a sequel to it soon. If you're looking for a nice big fantasy series. This is the 6th book in the series, and they're all like this big. They're all a couple 100 pages long. So if you're looking for something to occupy your time at the moment, this will definitely keep you occupied for a while. All right, so that is my middle bookshelf. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of my bookshelf series. Definitely has some of my more favorite books that I like on this shelf, which is probably why this video is going to be a bit longer than the last couple have been, but it's fine. Just to reiterate, if I'm going to recommend you anything off of this shelf, the best sci-fi off the shelf is everything by Becky Chambers. The best nonfiction book is Secret History of the Mongol Queens by Jack Weatherford. The best fantasy book, I would say, is the Daevabad books by S.A. Chakraborty. And probably the best historic fiction for me that I enjoyed the most is The Royal Diaries. If you end up picking any of these books and you like them or you dislike them, please let me know in the comments. If you have any suggestions for me, maybe based upon what you've seen so far, please put them in the comments. I'm always looking for something new to read. Follow me on Twitter or Instagram. We will be returning to archaeology content for the next video, but someone actually had said to me that they were looking forward to seeing more of my bookshelf, and since I really like talking about books, I thought that I would indulge them. Thank you so much guys for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!